see if we're getting closer now. That's the Vladimir Rusinov. That ship was in Siberia 7 days ago, and it's heading to Zeebrugge with its shipment of liquefied natural gas for the European market.
This is a detective story, one involving two massive ships, a nondescript office in Glasgow, and 10 billion euros going from Europe straight to Putin's front line with Ukraine. Our leaders promised action.
We are determined to stand up against Russia's brutal war.
This is now the moment for Europe to do something that is long overdue, and that is finally to wean ourselves off dependence on Russian oil and gas.
As you know, we aim to reduce this dependency on Russian fossil fuels and to get rid of it.
Yet, as a Sky News investigation has revealed, far from the taps being turned off, Europe remains reliant on Russian LNG, liquid natural gas, and British companies are facilitating its transfer. We were told sanctions would cripple Russia's economy, not to mention its war on Ukraine. That clearly has not happened. I'm Neil Patterson, and on today's Sky News Daily, we'll tell you why. He's back on the podcast, our economics and data editor, Ed Conway. We're getting our money's worth out of you this weekend. Look, we've just been hearing from Boris Johnson, Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission president. Now, our political leaders were absolutely adamant, weren't they, that we would stop using Russian fossil fuel.
There's this conventional wisdom that says that basically the war happened, Europe said, OK, we're going to stop taking your gas. Then Nord Stream pipeline, you know, that pipeline that goes through the Baltic, that was kind of shut down. There was sabotage or whatever it was. And I think people might have kind of led from that to the impression that basically we're not really getting much, if any, Russian gas anymore. There's also this other conventional wisdom that says that the cost of living crisis, it's over, and it's over because we were kind of remarkably successful at shifting our energy dependence. And I suppose on top of that, there's another conventional wisdom that says that of all the countries in Europe, the UK has been even tougher on sanctions than the rest of Europe. But when you kind of drill into all of this stuff, like all of those assumptions are really suspect. So Europe is still getting a lot of Russian gas. Yes, it's down, considerably from where it was before, but it's still a lot. And the reason for that is the pipeline gas might have gone down, but the amount of gas being shipped in on big tankers through liquefied natural gas, you kind of liquefy it down to kind of minus 160 degrees, and then you send it on a tanker, that has gone up. That's at record levels now.
And that's not covered by the sanctions that the UK and EU introduced.
That's the critical point here. So if you are an insurer and you're wondering, should I insure this tanker or that tanker, there is a very specific rule on oil tankers, okay? For liquefied natural gas, there is no such rule.
Tell us about the ships themselves, because, you've got your sea legs, you've been out there, you've seen them up close and personal.
They are kind of amazing ships. It's an amazing engineering feat. We never used to be able to do this. It's relatively recently that, you could actually transport gas in tankers, because, as I say, it's a gas and it needs to be liquefied down. And what's doubly amazing is these days they can make icebreaker LNG tankers, okay? And these are the ones we're talking about. They can go through sheet ice, years-old sheet ice, through the Siberian sea lanes into the Arctic Circle.
Specifically, where are these ships coming from then? I mean, is it directly from Russia?
It's directly from Russia. They come from Yamal, this area in Siberian Russia. They go from the port there. They load up with Russian gas there. They go down past Norway. Sometimes they go into the Irish Sea, depending on whether they're going to Bilbao, because sometimes they go to Spain. Spain is taking a lot of Russian gas right now. In fact, I think it's the second biggest provider, Russia, to Spain right now. They go to France. They go to Zeebrugge in Belgium.
What about the UK?
The UK has banned direct imports of Russian liquefied natural gas. And this comes back to that point that we kind of allow ourselves to feel that we are slightly holier than the rest of Europe because we're not directly taking Russian gas. But that's suspect for two reasons. First of all, we've been doing this for months, tracking these tankers, looking slightly, with some degree of shock at, hang on, this is just happening in front of everyone's eyes. These ships are going down our sea lanes, taking Russian gas to Europe. And it turns out there's just a big loophole in the sanctions here. We went and filmed one of these tankers coming in from Siberia to Zeebrugge and docking there. We got in a bit of trouble, actually, for going too close to it. They have police escorts, these tankers, because they're seen as so important.
But a bit of trouble?
I don't, we were told we were going a bit close.
Yeah.
But in a very friendly way, we were told you need to be a bit further away. That's what we do in the interest of trying to find out what's going on here. But the key point, Neil, is that there are no rules that say you can't insure LNG tankers. There are no rules that say you can't actually offer services to them. And that's what we've uncovered, that this runs deep. Russia could not run its fleet without British services.
Before we move on to that, let's talk the raw numbers here. I mean, can we put a figure on it? I mean, the percentage of gas that we are getting in Europe, what percentage of that is coming from Russia, and how much money, let's be honest about it, is Vladimir Putin making out of it?
So previously, it was about a third, so about 34%. It's now down to about 15%.
Okay, so it has significantly reduced.
It has significantly reduced. And that's part of, a lot of that extra gas has come in from the US in the form of LNG. A lot of that is explained by the fact that you just don't have pipelines for it to send it down. It would be an interesting question. If you still had enough pipeline capacity, would we still be buying up that gas? But to get rid of that last bit of Russian gas, part of the reason that we had this cost of living crisis, part of the reason that gas prices went up to catastrophic highs, was because people were thinking the worst case scenario about the gas market. They thought that this was going to be the end of Russian gas in Europe, but that's not what happened. In the event, part of the reason that gas prices came down, part of the reason Europe is able to replenish all of its storage, part of the reason that it still has industry running on gas is that it is still taking large quantities of Russian gas. And it's not taking them by mistake. It's taking them because it still wants the Russian gas.
Why are we not getting it from, for example, countries that are not currently waging war on the eastern frontier of Europe? And why do we need this LNG?
In the long run, you need places like Qatar and the US to really ramp up the amount of liquefied natural gas they're exporting. At the moment, I don't know that there is enough global capacity to replace that Russian gas very easily. A lot of people look at the schedule of different plants they're going to be opening and say, listen, actually, maybe by late 2025, 2026, Europe might be able to be truly independent of Russian gas. But the point is, Ukraine might not have that long. It probably doesn't have that long. And that's the point here is, in the meantime, we are paying Putin billions of euros in revenues that then get put into the war effort. And we, the UK, may not be directly buying that LNG, but we're facilitating it.
There are insurers in this country, and there is certainly no suggestion that they are acting in any way illegally. However, they are, as you say, directly facilitating the transfer of this LNG from Russian territory to European territory.
Correct. Insurance companies in the City of London are insuring ships, LNG tankers, that go directly from Russia to Europe. And when we ask people about this, when we ask the insurance companies about this, they're like, yeah, we do that. The UK P&I Club, they're one of the many kind of maritime insurers in London. And they say, listen, this is not sanctioned. If it were sanctioned, then maybe it would be a different question. Now, in fairness, they have to follow legislation and the law has left these gaping holes. And I talked to people in the UK government, and they don't really have a very good answer for this. We asked Keir Starmer about it. He didn't have a very good answer for it. No one particularly wants to confront this because it's just so awkward.
Did you detect in your conversations with these insurers any level of discomfort at what they were doing?
It's slightly unapologetic. Them's the rules. We're sticking to the rules. And if the rules change, then we'll change our things accordingly. And so in the end, you've got to ask whether the rules are right. And there's no reason why the government couldn't have imposed rules that were tougher on these exports.
Well, let's talk about a place very close to my heart, very close to my family, in fact, Glasgow, right next to the Clyde, once the world's home of shipbuilding, no longer, of course, but still with a very long and proud maritime tradition. You went to the headquarters of an organisation called Seapeak. Explain who they are.
I'd never heard of them before, I should say, and most people might not have, because they're quite an obscure company that deals in something that is important, which is operating a lot of these vessels around the world. They operate LNG tankers. So I think there's only 12 or 14 of these icebreaker LNGs who are able to do this trade, and they go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth from Siberia to Europe all the time. And 4 of those ships are operated by this company based in Glasgow. And so you have people who are actually helping to run these ships in Britain. And these ships are this financial link that allows Vladimir Putin to make billions of euros, which then goes into the war effort. So we, again, are a part of it. And I tried. When I found this out, I was I was slightly aghast. Again, you can make the same point. It's not against the sanctions rule.
Absolutely not.
And actually, I kind of was expecting for CPIC, the company, to do that. But we called and called and called and called and called, emailed and emailed and emailed and emailed. Nothing at all. In fact, one time I did get someone say, oh, we'll pass that on. Nothing at all. And so eventually, after getting nothing, then we went up to try and visit them in Glasgow.
You got your foot in the door, literally.
Hi, hello. Hi, my name's Ed Conway. I work for Sky News, and we've come to talk to CPIC.
Got into the lobby and, was told that they would call the police if we stayed.
You don't have an appointment where you can speak to them.
Right, okay. Is anyone going to come down and talk to us?
No.
No? And even if we stay here all day and we're waiting...
I'll phone the police.
You'll phone the police?
Pity the poor security guard who was on duty that day when you come wandering through the revolving door.
But
again, you had been in touch with them. They must have known you were going to pitch up at some...
I was calling them, and there was always a kind of voicemail message. And suddenly on the day that we came, and suddenly when I pitched up, they turned off the voicemail. So suddenly you couldn't even call. And they kept saying, well, we can't see you without an appointment. I'm like, well, you don't want to give me an appointment. So it turned into one of those slightly Kafkaesque situations.
But again, we go back to the central point of your reporting, and I'll repeat, this is not the only loophole in the sanctions that you have discovered, but that the money that is being spent by Europe on liquid natural gas goes via the Russian treasury to the front line of that battle in Ukraine. And let's be honest, I mean, the Russian economy at the best of times is not a world leader, is it?
We were told that the sanctions were going to cripple the Russian economy, and they've done nothing of the sort. We were told that they were going to be the toughest yet. And that may well be the case, but there are so many loopholes. And this is what I think makes this story kind of uncomfortable. We're part of this. We're all part of this.
Ed, pause there. We will be back in just a moment to explain why these restrictions on the Russian economy are seemingly so porous. Stay there. Welcome back. Ed Conway is here, revealing the extent to which Europe still relies on Russian liquid natural gas, despite Western leaders promising otherwise. And I suppose that is the point, isn't it, Ed? That there just isn't the willingness nor the ability, as of yet, to turn off the gas entirely.
There's an enormous debate going on at the moment. Some people are saying we need to sanction Russian LNG. The reason that hasn't happened is because places like Germany are saying you cannot allow this to happen. It's Germany who's resisting this. And it's Germany resisting this because that's just the end of a lot of German manufacturing if that happens. And this is happening now, with more than 2 years after the invasion of Ukraine, and we are still having this debate. And I think for anyone who's nervous about what happens if the war doesn't go Vladimir Putin's way, he does still have this other button that he could press that would cripple a lot of Europe.
The thing that I find fascinating and perhaps slightly terrifying is the way in which, as we've already heard, political leaders in Europe sold the sanctions to us, not just as a means of diminishing, degrading the Russian economy, but as a way of crippling it. By way of contrast, I mean, the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, speaking in the Commons not that long ago. Let's just have a quick listen.
I did read at length the Ed Conway excellent thread this morning talking about this issue, and it is, I think, the case that when you set up sanctions, initially they tend to work, and then rather like water flowing around a boulder in a stream, they'll eventually work their way around and find another route to markets.
I mean, first and foremost, Ed, let's ignore the ego boost that you will clearly have received from having the Defence Secretary.
That was a different story.
I know, another in a long line of these stories that you've been producing. But is he right? Is it the case that sanctions will only ever work temporarily? Or is he wrong? Did we just oversell the raft of sanctions that we introduced?
There are examples of sanctions working a lot better than these ones. The best example is Iran. So when the US sanctioned Iran and did what was known as secondary sanctions, which basically said, if you're, let's say, a European or an Asian company doing business with Iran, we're going to sanction you as well, anyone who does business with them. We haven't done that this time. But yeah, I think the issue is that the sanctions weren't quite as aggressive as we made them seem at first. And I think the secondary thing is Russia is just really good at responding to this. They're really good at trying to work around these things. And the example that Grant Shapps was talking about, something we've talked about because it was a previous story that I did, was about sending goods via Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and other countries into Russia, sanctioned goods. Just Russia's very good at doing that kind of thing. Let's say we were to say you can't insure Russian LNG ships, or you can't, like CP can't operate them. I suspect Russia would pretty quickly, and in fact there's evidence that it's already kind of looking at setting up its own dark fleet of tankers that wouldn't come under UK auspices or UK insurance.
Dark fleets, you're going to have to educate me. What does that mean?
Okay, so basically this is where Russians buy some old ships, essentially, and because they don't have to obey any of these rules because they're Russia and the rules are all against them, they don't. And so rather than being the kind of fleets that are insured by places in the UK and run by European countries, they are dark fleets run by Russia. That's the name people have given them. So I suspect Russia would find a way around it. But he's right in that you have to kind of work at this stuff. And it does seem like the UK and the rest of Europe slightly lacks the courage of its convictions when it comes to imposing this stuff. And on the one hand, we're helping support Ukraine, and on the other hand, we're
supporting
imposing,
their enemies.
Yeah, just in a leaky, semi-inadvertent way.
But semi-inadvertent it may well be, but as you just pointed out, I mean, this isn't the only loophole that has been found in sanctions, that we have seen other items flowing to Russia in a way in which they should not. We have seen other revenue streams opening up for the Russians, not to mention the fact that, originally this Russian central bank was absolutely stuffed full of currency in the first place because probably they saw some of this coming.
Yeah, and I think this was always going to be a long war. It was always going to be tough, and it was always going to come to the question of how much are you willing to sacrifice your way of living to prosecute this war. And in Europe right now, the revealed preference of how much people are willing to sacrifice their way of living is not much.
Is this one of those situations, though, where the body politic, where the likes of you and me have to be slightly more mature in our thinking about things? This is realpolitik. Yes, we are in a conflict, with Russia via Ukraine, but at the same time, life goes on in this country. Business goes on. We still need a cup of tea in the morning and the kettle to boil, and we need the heating to come on at night.
Energy, these base substances, that is the foundation of our lives. And you don't spend much time thinking about energy or where it comes from until suddenly it's gone. You don't spend much time thinking about steel and where it comes from until suddenly it's gone. Or the same thing with, PPE during COVID. Things that seem kind of whatever are incredibly important when push comes to shove. And Russia, it just happens to have not a monopoly, but an enormous control over those basic materials that we all need. And right now in Europe, we don't have much in the way of our own energy production, and we are being shown as enormously vulnerable.
And following on from our conversation on the podcast yesterday and the conspiracy of silence that the Institute for Fiscal Studies saw in our two main parties and their manifestos and their plans, again, this is another issue that, frankly, at best, has been dealt with tangentially by our politicians.
At best. And, I've tried to get kind of firm responses from government on this. But again, think about the car thing, okay? Everyone looks at the data that we've had on Sky, immediately comes to the same conclusion, which is it looks like UK cars are going to Russia by the back door, via Azerbaijan. You can't prove it 100% because you can't track them once they leave the country. But it just looks so obvious. Azerbaijan's just become one of our biggest trading partners for cars, suddenly taking more luxury cars than Switzerland, for heaven's sake. So everyone with half a brain cell would look at that and go, there's something kind of a bit rum here. But then whether it's the business secretary or the shadow business secretary, do they want to clamp down on our biggest physical export that earns this country hundreds of millions of pounds just in terms of that particular trade? No, they kind of don't. And so again, you run into this realpolitik, as you call it, of, the sanctions are a really noble idea, but when it comes to implementing them, it's much tougher.
Okay, but hand on heart, come on. Do you think anyone outside this room cares?
Yes, I actually do think people out there care. I think there's widespread support for Ukraine versus Putin. So I do think that there's a lot of people who would like for these sanctions to work, who would like for Ukraine to be able to do well on the battlefield rather than being kind of overpowered by Russian might. And so I hope that people kind of listen to stories like this and think, well, that's just not good enough. Because it's not, it's not really. It's not the story that we've been sold by our government, our ministers.
100%.
And yet that is what is happening. The more you delve into it, the more of these depressing holes you see where it turns out we're not actually implementing this stuff as well as we said that we would.
Nice bit of work, Ed. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Of course, we offered a right of reply to those mentioned in today's podcast. The UK P&I Club, which insures the Vladimir Russinov and a number of other LNG carriers, said this: the direct carriage of LNG from the Yamal to Zeebrugge and provision of insurance services for such carriage is not presently sanctioned. If the EU and G7 nations were to change their policy, the club would of course comply by adjusting or withdrawing its services. Seapeak Maritime, which owns and operates Yakov Gakel and 4 other LNG icebreakers that operate in Siberia, were, as Ed mentioned, contacted, but declined to comment. Such was Europe's reliance on Russian gas prior to the invasion of Ukraine that it's not entirely surprising that €10 billion has been spent on it since the war began. But the sanctions were sold as game-changing, war-ending. We now discover there are loopholes big enough to sail LNG tankers through. Still, which politician would be brave enough to confess that, for now at least, the cost of keeping the lights on, of beginning to exit the cost of living crisis, is money, stacks of money, flowing via the Kremlin straight to the Ukrainian front line? That's your lot for this edition of The Daily. We're back again tomorrow.